It was on a crisp October morning in 1934 that Hercule Poirot received what he would later describe as the most interesting contradiction of his career. I had called upon my old friend at his immaculate flat in Whitehaven Mansions, finding him, as usual, engaged in the precise arrangement of his morning correspondence. Each envelope was aligned with mathematical precision, sorted by size, and opened with a paper knife that gleamed like a surgical instrument. "Ah, Hastings," he exclaimed, his green eyes twinkling with pleasure. "You arrive at the perfect moment. Observe, if you please, this most curious phenomenon." He gestured toward two telegrams lying side by side on his desk, their yellow forms creating what appeared to be a deliberate contrast. With characteristic precision, he adjusted them until their edges aligned perfectly. "Read, mon ami, and tell me what strikes you as remarkable." The first telegram, dated 3 days prior, bore the sender's name Whitmore and read, "Your reputation precedes you. Stop require immediate consultation regarding matter of utmost delicacy. Stop house party. Weekend provides perfect cover. Stop formal invitation follows. Stop discretion essential. Stop Whitmore." The second, received that very morning, was from the same sender. "Regret previous communication. Stop matter resolved satisfactorily. Stop your services no longer required. Stop suggest you decline invitation. Stop Whitmore." I studied both messages carefully, noting the stark difference in tone. "Well," I said slowly, "it appears Lord Whitmore has had a change of heart. Perhaps he's resolved whatever difficulty was troubling him." Poirot's moustaches twitched with what I recognized as suppressed amusement. "Hastings, you possess the admirable quality of always seeing the surface of things with perfect clarity. But consider what lies beneath." He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers in that familiar gesture of concentration. "Lord Whitmore, for indeed it is the Earl of Whitmore who has written these messages, first begs for my assistance with a matter of utmost delicacy. He suggests a house party as a cover, implying the need for secrecy. Then, 3 days later, he not merely cancels this request, he actively discourages my attendance." "Perhaps he solved the problem himself," I suggested. "Ah, but notice the language, mon cher. Matter resolved satisfactorily. This is not the relief of a man who has found a solution. It is the resignation of one who has been silenced. And observe this phrase. Suggest you decline invitation, not withdraw invitation or cancel engagement, but suggest you decline. Why would a man who no longer requires assistance concern himself with my social calendar?" Before I could respond, our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Poirot's valet, Georges, bearing a silver salver with the Morning Post. Among the usual assortment of letters was an envelope of heavy cream paper bearing an embossed coronet. "The formal invitation," Poirot murmured, slitting it open with his customary care. "Posted, I observe, on the same day as the first telegram." The invitation was everything one would expect from an earl's household. Elegant script on finest paper, requesting the pleasure of Monsieur Hercule Poirot's company at Whitmore Abbey for a weekend house party, beginning Friday evening. The occasion was listed as a celebration of family traditions and friendships. "So," I said, "you have the invitation he promised to send. Will you go?" Poirot rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the London street with that peculiar intensity he brought to all observations. "Consider the psychology, Hastings. Lord Whitmore summons me in desperation, then attempts to dismiss me. But he cannot recall the invitation. It has already been posted. So instead, he suggests I decline. This tells me 2 things. First, that whatever troubled him initially has not been resolved, merely suppressed. And second, that someone does not wish Hercule Poirot to visit Whitmore Abbey." "Someone?" "But certainly. Either Lord Whitmore himself has developed cold feet, unlikely, given the urgency of his first communication, or someone else has discovered his intention to consult me and has influenced his decision. He turned from the window, his expression grave. When someone actively seeks to prevent my involvement in a case, Hastings, it is usually because they have something to hide, something significant enough to risk the Earl's displeasure. You think there's been a crime? I think, mon ami, that there is about to be one, or perhaps has already been one, and the perpetrator fears discovery. He moved to his desk and began gathering the telegrams and invitation. We shall accept Lord Whitmore's hospitality, despite his change of heart. Sometimes the most important cases are those we are not supposed to investigate. The journey to Whitmore Abbey. The train journey to Gloucestershire provided ample opportunity for Poirot to share what he knew of our unwilling host. Lord Whitmore, it appeared, was a man of considerable wealth and social standing, whose family had held their title for 3 centuries. The current Earl had inherited not only the title and estates, but also a reputation for collecting rare gems, a passion that had made him both famous and, according to some, vulnerable to the attentions of less scrupulous individuals. The Whitmore collection is legendary, Poirot explained as our train wound through the autumn countryside. Particularly the emeralds. There is one stone, the heart of Ceylon, that is said to be without equal. Such treasures attract not only admiration, but also covetousness. You think someone is after his gems? It is possible. But remember, Hastings, that the most precious things are not always made of stone and metal. Sometimes the most valuable commodity is silence. Whitmore Abbey appeared through the mist like something from a Gothic novel, a magnificent pile of honey-colored stone rising from manicured grounds, its towers and battlements speaking of centuries of power and privilege. As our taxi wound up the long drive, I noticed other vehicles arriving. Clearly, the house party was already in progress. We were met at the entrance by a butler whose bearing suggested long service and absolute discretion. "Monsieur Poirot?" he inquired, his voice carefully neutral. "I am Henley. His lordship is expecting you." The hesitation was slight but unmistakable. Poirot, I noticed, filed it away with that mental precision that characterized his approach to every detail. The gathering of suspects. The drawing room into which we were shown contained perhaps a dozen people, arranged in small groups with the careful casualness of English society. Conversations paused as we entered, and I was conscious of being assessed by eyes that held varying degrees of curiosity, wariness, and in 1 or 2 cases, what might have been alarm. Lord Whitmore himself approached us with the measured gait of a man performing a duty rather than welcoming friends. He was a tall, distinguished figure in his early 60s, with silver hair and the bearing of one accustomed to command. But his eyes, I noticed, held a haunted quality that spoke of sleepless nights and unanswered fears. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, extending his hand with what appeared to be genuine warmth, though I detected an underlying tension. "How good of you to come. I trust your journey was comfortable." "Entirely satisfactory, my lord. You are most kind to include us in your celebration." If Whitmore noticed the emphasis on us, he gave no sign. Instead, he turned to perform the necessary introductions, and I found myself studying each face as names and relationships were revealed. There was Lady Whitmore, a woman of perhaps 50 with the kind of understated elegance that spoke of generations of breeding. Her smile was gracious but distant, and she acknowledged Poirot with the polite interest one might show a curiosity rather than a guest. The Earl's younger brother, Captain James Whitmore, was a man whose military bearing could not quite disguise a certain dissolute quality around the eyes. His handshake was firm, but his gaze was evasive. Miss Victoria Ashford, introduced as Lady Whitmore's niece, was a striking young woman of perhaps 25, with dark hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. She regarded Poirot with what might have been amusement. Dr. Harold Pemberton, the family physician, was a man of middle years whose professional manner could not quite conceal an underlying nervousness. His greeting was cordial, but brief. There were others. A young man introduced as the Earl's godson, an elderly woman who was apparently a family friend of long standing, a couple from London whose connection to the family was not entirely clear. Each introduction was performed with scrupulous politeness, but I could not shake the feeling that we were being presented to a carefully arranged tableau rather than a genuine gathering of friends. Throughout these pleasantries, Poirot maintained his customary courteous demeanor, but I knew him well enough to recognize the signs of intense observation. His eyes missed nothing, not the way Lady Whitmore's fingers trembled slightly as she lifted her teacup, nor the manner in which Captain Whitmore avoided his brother's gaze, nor the curious tension that seemed to exist between Miss Ashford and the young man introduced as the godson. "I trust," Lord Whitmore said as the introductions concluded, "that you will find our little gathering entertaining, Monsieur Poirot. We are quite informal here, just a few old friends enjoying the countryside. I am certain it will prove most educational," Poirot replied, his choice of words causing the Earl's eyes to sharpen momentarily. As we were shown to our rooms to prepare for dinner, I could not help but observe to my companion that the atmosphere seemed rather strained for what was supposedly a celebration. "Indeed, Hastings," he murmured as we climbed the grand staircase. "This is a house where everyone has something to hide, and where at least one person fears what Hercule Poirot might discover. Before this weekend is concluded, I suspect we shall learn why Lord Whitmore summoned me so urgently, and why someone else was so determined that I should not come." He paused at the landing, his gaze taking in the portraits of long-dead Whitmores that lined the walls, their painted eyes seeming to watch our progress with centuries of accumulated secrets. "The little grey cells, they are already at work, mon ami, and they tell me that this house party will prove far more interesting than any of our fellow guests imagine." Dinner at Whitmore Abbey proceeded with the ritualistic precision of centuries-old tradition. Crystal gleamed under candlelight, silver cutlery was deployed with mathematical accuracy, and conversation flowed in carefully modulated tones. Poirot, seated between Lady Whitmore and the elderly Mrs. Cavendish, maintained his characteristic expression of polite interest while cataloguing every glance, every hesitation, every word left unspoken. The dining room itself was a cavernous chamber, panelled in dark oak that seemed to absorb the flickering light. We sat around a table of polished mahogany that stretched between us like a frozen lake, the distance between guests serving only to amplify the heavy silences that fell whenever the servants withdrew into the shadows. From my position further down the table, I could observe the interplay of personalities that would later prove so significant. Captain James Whitmore drank rather more wine than seemed strictly necessary, his voice growing louder as the courses progressed. Dr. Pemberton ate sparingly and spoke less, his attention frequently drawn to Lord Whitmore at the head of the table. The Earl himself presided with the weary grace of a man performing an inescapable duty. "You must find us terribly provincial after London, Monsieur Poirot," Lady Whitmore remarked, her voice carrying that particular tone of aristocratic condescension. "We lead such quiet lives here in the country." "On the contrary, madame," Poirot replied with exquisite courtesy, "I find that human nature reveals itself most clearly in such settings. In the city, one can hide behind anonymity. In a house such as this, where everyone knows everyone else, the truth has a way of emerging despite our best efforts to conceal it." The comment fell into the conversation like a stone into still water. Miss Ashford's fork paused halfway to her lips. Captain Whitmore's laugh became forced. Dr. Pemberton coughed delicately into his napkin. Only Lord Whitmore seemed unsurprised, meeting Poirot's gaze with something that might have been resignation. "You are a collector, I believe, Lord Whitmore?" Poirot asked suddenly. "I've heard tales of the Whitmore emeralds. They are, one hears, quite magnificent." The effect was electric. Lady Whitmore's hand jerked, sending wine splashing onto the pristine tablecloth. Captain James let out a sharp laugh entirely devoid of humor. "Magnificent and cursed," James sneered, reaching for his wine-glass with an unsteady hand. "That's the family legend, isn't it? Bad luck to anyone who tries to sell them, and worse luck to anyone who keeps them." "That is enough, James," Lord Whitmore snapped, his face flushing. "We do not discuss such matters at table." "And yet," Poirot murmured, dabbing his lips with his napkin, "stones have a permanence that hearts do not. They do not change, they do not lie, and they do not betray. Unlike, perhaps, people." Heavy silence followed this pronouncement. Dr. Pemberton's spoon clattered against his dessert bowl. I noticed how Miss Ashford shot a warning glance toward the young man introduced as Julian Vane, the Earl's godson, whose face had grown pale. After the ladies withdrew, the atmosphere grew even more oppressive. Lord Whitmore seemed to shrink into his chair, the earlier flash of anger replaced by weary resignation. Captain James moved to the fireplace, swirling his port until it threatened to spill. "So, the famous sleuth," James drawled, looking down at Poirot with open disdain. "Here to solve a crime that hasn't happened? Or did my brother finally call you in to audit the family accounts?" "I am here," Poirot said, his voice perfectly level, "because I was invited, and because I find the atmosphere of this house most stimulating. There is a tension here, Captain, like a violin string wound too tight. One wonders when it will snap." When we rejoined the ladies in the drawing room, I noticed the strain had intensified. Miss Ashford played melancholy Chopin with surprising skill. Lady Whitmore presided over tea with mechanical precision. Through it all, Poirot observed, his green eyes missing nothing. As we prepared to retire, Lord Whitmore approached Poirot in the corridor, glancing nervously to ensure we were alone. "Monsieur Poirot," he said urgently, "I must apologize for my second telegram. I was persuaded that your presence was unnecessary, but I was wrong. Tomorrow morning, early, before the others wake, I must speak with you privately. Can you meet me in the library at 6 o'clock? "But certainly, my lord." Whitmore nodded, relief flooding his features. "Thank you, and Monsieur Poirot, trust no one, not even those who appear most trustworthy." "Each little group is complete in itself," Poirot murmured to me as Whitmore disappeared. "No mingling, no easy flow. It is a house of compartments, mon ami, and something here is about to break." The October dawn crept through Whitmore Abbey with reluctant fingers of grey light, casting long shadows across corridors that had witnessed 3 centuries of family secrets. Poirot rose at precisely 5:30, his morning ablutions performed with the methodical care that characterized every aspect of his existence. By 5:45, we were descending the grand staircase, our footsteps muffled by thick Persian runners worn smooth by generations of Whitmore feet. The library occupied the oldest wing of the house, a magnificent chamber lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes whose collective wisdom seemed powerless against whatever darkness had settled over this household. A fire had been laid, but not lit. The room held the peculiar chill of spaces long undisturbed by human warmth. We settled into leather chairs that creaked with age, waiting for our host to fulfill his urgent appointment. 6 o'clock came and passed. Then 10 passed. Poirot's expression grew increasingly grave, his fingers drumming a silent rhythm against the chair arm. The grandfather clock's measured ticking seemed to grow louder in the silence, each chime marking another minute of Lord Whitmore's unexplained absence. "Something is wrong, Hastings," Poirot said finally, rising with sudden decision. "Lord Whitmore is a man of military precision. The bearing, the aristocratic training, they do not permit lateness for appointments of such desperate importance. We must investigate." I followed him through corridors that stretched like arteries in some vast sleeping creature. The family wing lay in the south tower, overlooking gardens where mist clung to ancient yews like ghostly shrouds. We encountered Henley ascending the servants' stairs, a silver breakfast tray balanced in his hands. "Ah, Henley," Poirot called softly. "You take Lord Whitmore his morning tea?" "Indeed, sir, though I confess I received no answer when I knocked. Most unusual. His lordship is invariably awake by 6. "Then we shall accompany you. I fear something may be amiss." The butler's composure faltered slightly, but he led us up the main staircase to the second floor. At a heavy oak door near the corridor's end, he paused and knocked with correct, discreet firmness. Silence answered. He knocked again, more urgently this time. "My lord, your breakfast, sir." Still nothing. Henley's face had grown pale. With trembling fingers, he produced his master key and inserted it into the lock. The door swung open to reveal Lord Whitmore's sitting room, empty and undisturbed. But the bedroom door beyond stood slightly ajar. What we found there would remain etched in my memory forever. Lord Whitmore lay upon his bed, still dressed in his evening clothes, his face peaceful in death. One hand rested on his chest, the other hung loosely at his side. On the nightstand beside him stood a glass, half filled with water, and an empty bottle that had once contained sleeping tablets. Henley made a strangled sound and stepped backward. Poirot moved forward with swift precision, checking for pulse and breathing, though both were clearly absent. His examination was thorough but respectful, his keen eyes noting every detail. "He has been dead perhaps 2 hours," Poirot murmured. "The rigor mortis, it has not yet established itself fully. Hastings, observe everything but touch nothing. This room tells us a story, but we must read it with the utmost care." The chamber was orderly to an obsessive degree. Books aligned precisely on shelves, clothing folded with military precision, personal items arranged with geometric exactitude. Yet something felt wrong, though I could not immediately identify what troubled my instincts. "The glass," Poirot said suddenly, his voice sharp with interest. "You see it, Hastings? Half full of water, positioned perfectly centered on the coaster. Not carelessly placed as one might expect from a man in extremis. And the bottle, empty, yes, but arranged with its label facing outward, as though displayed for viewing." Before I could respond, sounds in the corridor announced the arrival of others. Dr. Pemberton appeared first, drawn by some instinct of disaster, his face pale with shock. Behind him came the other members of the household, Lady Whitmore, Captain James, Miss Ashford, young Vane, all crowding forward to witness the tragedy that would transform their weekend gathering into something far more sinister. Lady Whitmore's scream pierced the morning silence. Captain James pushed past the doctor, his face contorted with an emotion that might have been grief, or might have been something else entirely. "Good God," Dr. Pemberton breathed, moving toward the bed with professional instinct. "When did this happen?" "That," Poirot said quietly, his green eyes taking in every face, every reaction, every telltale gesture, "is precisely what we must determine. And more importantly, whether Lord Whitmore died by his own hand, or whether someone in this house decided that his secret meeting with Hercule Poirot must never take place." The death of Lord Whitmore sent shockwaves through the assembled household, transforming what had been a weekend of strained civility into something far more sinister. Dr. Pemberton, summoned from his guest quarters, conducted his examination with the methodical precision of long medical practice, though his hands trembled slightly as he worked. "Lord Whitmore has been deceased for approximately 2 to 3 hours, he announced to the gathering in the sitting room adjacent to the death chamber. "The immediate cause appears to be an overdose of veronal, a powerful barbiturate I prescribed for his chronic insomnia. The entire contents of the bottle have been consumed, representing perhaps 30 times the therapeutic dose." Lady Whitmore, supported by her niece Miss Ashford, looked up with red-rimmed eyes. "Suicide?" she whispered, the word barely audible. "It would seem so," Dr. Pemberton replied reluctantly. "Though I must say, such a deliberate overdose suggests a determined intent to die." "Rubbish!" Captain James exploded, his face flushed with brandy and emotion. Edward was no coward. He'd never take the easy way out, no matter how desperate things became. Desperate? Poirot inquired softly, his green eyes sharpening with interest. James laughed bitterly. Everyone knew about the debts. The estate's been hemorrhaging money for years. Death duties from father's passing nearly destroyed us. Edward was drowning in obligations he could never hope to meet. And yet, Miss Ashford interjected quietly, Uncle Edward was not a man to surrender. Whatever his troubles, he faced them directly. Cowardice was never among his failings. Poirot had been conducting his own examination of the death chamber, moving with that peculiar precision that characterized all his actions. The positioning of the water glass, the careful arrangement of the empty bottle, the peaceful expression on the dead man's face, all spoke to him of something more complex than simple despair. Inspector Miller, the local constable who had arrived within the hour, seemed content to accept the suicide explanation. But Poirot requested permission to conduct what he termed clarifying conversations with each member of the household. Lady Whitmore was first, her composure barely maintained as she sat rigidly on the morning-room sofa. "My husband was deeply troubled," she admitted. "He suspected someone intended to steal the Whitmore emeralds. He trusted no one lately, not even James." "Did he mention any specific suspicions, Madame?" "He spoke of changing his will," she said reluctantly. "He was particularly concerned about Julian, said the boy had disappointed him gravely." When Julian Vane entered for his interview, the young man's pallor was alarming. "I know what you're thinking," he said before Poirot could speak. "Uncle Edward threatened to disinherit me. We argued about my future. He wanted me in the army. I wanted to study art. But I never took his threats seriously. He often said such things when angry." Captain James, when questioned, provided a different perspective. "Edward told me last night he was definitely changing the will. Said Julian was unworthy of the name. The boy stood to lose everything." But it was Miss Ashford who provided the most crucial information. Sitting with perfect composure, she fixed Poirot with an intelligent gaze. "I saw someone leaving Uncle Edward's room last night, around midnight. A man in a dressing gown, tall, but in the darkness, I couldn't identify him specifically. Could it have been Dr. Pemberton, Captain Whitmore, perhaps young Vane? Any of them, I'm afraid. In the corridor's shadows, all figures look alike." Dr. Pemberton, when questioned again, grew increasingly uncomfortable. "The dosage troubles me greatly," he admitted. "To consume an entire bottle of Veronal would require deliberate intent. But the peaceful expression, the careful arrangement of the scene, it suggests someone who went to sleep expecting never to wake." Poirot stood at the morning-room window, gazing out at the mist-shrouded grounds. "Consider the evidence, mes amis. The glass of water, positioned with mathematical precision. The empty bottle, arranged with its label facing outward as though displayed for examination. The door locked from within, yes, but that proves nothing. And most significantly, the timing." He turned to face the assembled group, his expression grave. "Lord Whitmore summoned me urgently, then attempted to dismiss me. Last night he insisted upon a private meeting at 6 o'clock this morning, warning me to trust no one. Now, mere hours before that meeting, he is found dead under circumstances that appear to be suicide, but contain irregularities that trouble my little grey cells considerably." "What irregularities?" Captain James demanded, his voice sharp with something that might have been fear. Poirot's smile was thin and entirely without warmth. "The locked room is both evidence and misdirection. Someone in this house knew of our planned meeting. Someone who had compelling reasons to ensure that conversation never occurred. This was no suicide, nor accident. Lord Whitmore was silenced, and his killer stands among us now, wondering if Hercule Poirot has noticed the one crucial detail they overlooked in their carefully orchestrated deception." Inspector Miller shifted uncomfortably, his ruddy face betraying the limitations of his provincial experience. "But Monsieur Poirot, the locked door, surely that proves suicide." How else could the killer have escaped? Ah, Inspector, Poirot replied with infinite patience. The locked room is the oldest misdirection in the murderer's repertoire. It dazzles us with its impossibility while we overlook the simple truth that the killer never needed to escape because the crime was committed elsewhere. He moved to the center of the morning room, his small figure commanding attention through sheer force of intellect. Consider the mechanics, mes amis. Dr. Pemberton, you prescribed veronal for Lord Whitmore's insomnia. Describe its properties, if you please. The doctor cleared his throat nervously. Veronal is extremely bitter, almost impossible to swallow without water. Even a single tablet requires considerable effort. Precisely. Yet we are asked to believe Lord Whitmore consumed 30 such tablets, 30 bitter, chalky pills, washed down with half a glass of water. Where is the residue? Where are the crushed fragments? Where is the evidence of struggle against such a revolting taste? Poirot's green eyes swept the assembled faces. No, Lord Whitmore did not swallow 30 tablets. The poison was administered in another form entirely. Lady Whitmore's voice was barely a whisper. But how? He took nothing after dinner except his evening whiskey, Poirot finished softly. His customary nightcap, prepared from the decanter in his study. A decanter accessible to anyone in this household. Captain James laughed harshly, but the sound carried no mirth. You're suggesting someone dissolved veronal in Edward's whiskey. That's preposterous. He would have tasted it immediately. Would he? Whiskey is itself bitter, with complex flavors that might mask other tastes. And a man accustomed to his evening ritual, reading his correspondence, reviewing his concerns. Such a man might not notice a slight alteration in familiar flavors until too late. Dr. Pemberton nodded slowly, his professional mind grasping the implications. Dissolved in alcohol, the absorption would be rapid. He might have felt drowsy within minutes, attributed it to fatigue, and retired normally to his room. Where he locked the door by habit, Poirot continued, and succumbed to the poison in his own bed. The killer then needed only to arrange the theatrical props, the empty bottle, the precisely positioned glass, to create the illusion of deliberate suicide. The logic was inexorable, and I could see its effect on the assembled company. Miss Ashford had gone very pale, while Julian Vane gripped the back of his chair with white knuckles. But why? Lady Whitmore asked desperately. Why would anyone want to kill Edward? Ah, madame, that brings us to the eternal question. Cui bono? Who benefits? Your husband spoke of changing his will, creating immediate anxiety among potential heirs. He feared for his emeralds, suggesting knowledge of some threat. And consider this curious detail. Someone intercepted his correspondence to send that second telegram dismissing my services. Poirot moved to the window, his reflection ghostly in the morning light. The telegrams trouble me greatly, for they reveal a mind at work, behind the scenes. The first message carried urgency, personality, desperation, the authentic voice of a man in fear. The second was cold, formal, lacking emotional texture. They were not written by the same hand. You're certain? Inspector Miller asked. As certain as I am that someone in this house knew of our planned meeting and was determined to prevent it. Someone who feared what Lord Whitmore might reveal about... He was interrupted by a commotion in the corridor. Henley appeared, his usual composure shattered, followed by a young housemaid whose face was white with terror. Forgive the intrusion, Henley said, his voice strained. But there has been a discovery. Mary was cleaning the study when she noticed. Perhaps you should see for yourselves. We followed him through corridors that seemed to press closer with each step. In Lord Whitmore's study, behind the portrait of the first Earl, the wall safe stood open like a wound in the panelled wall. The heavy door, which should have been secured by combination lock, swung freely on its hinges. Inside, the velvet-lined cases that had housed the legendary Whitmore emeralds lay empty. Mon Dieu, Poirot breathed, examining the lock mechanism with his magnifying glass. No force was used. The combination was known to the thief. See here, the dial turns smoothly, the tumblers align perfectly. This was opened by someone with authorized access. Captain James stared into the empty safe, his face ashen. The entire collection, gone. The heart of Ceylon, the Duchess's tears, the Maharaja's gift, centuries of family treasure. Not gone, Poirot corrected, straightening with that peculiar intensity that marked his moments of greatest insight. Taken, but taken when? And more importantly, why now? Why steal the emeralds when the house is full of witnesses, including a detective specifically summoned to investigate suspicious circumstances? Lady Whitmore sank into a chair, overwhelmed. First Edward, now this. What kind of monster? Not a monster, madame, Poirot said gently. A human being driven by very human motives, but a human being who believes themselves cleverer than they are. For you see, this theft was meant to be discovered, just as the suicide was meant to be accepted without question. He turned to face the assembled company, his expression grave. We have two crimes that appear unconnected but are intimately linked. A murder disguised as suicide and a theft that was meant to be found. The question is not what connects them, but what they were designed to conceal. The silence stretched taut as violin strings, broken only by the distant ticking of the grandfather clock. Someone in this room was a killer and a thief, but more than that. Someone who had constructed an elaborate deception that depended on Hercule Poirot never arriving to investigate. The little grey cells, Poirot murmured. They tell me we are looking at this backwards. We assume the murder was committed to facilitate the theft, but what if the theft was committed to conceal the motive for murder? What if these emeralds were never stolen at all, but had already disappeared, and Lord Whitmore had discovered the truth? The revelation that the emeralds might have vanished long before this weekend sent tremors through the assembled company. Lady Whitmore gripped her handkerchief until her knuckles whitened, while Captain James moved restlessly to the window, his military bearing unable to disguise a growing agitation. We must establish facts before theories, Poirot announced, his methodical nature asserting itself. Inspector Miller, you mentioned examining the safe last evening with Lord Whitmore. Describe this encounter precisely. Miller shifted uncomfortably. His lordship seemed nervous, insisted on checking the safe himself, said it was a nightly ritual, ensuring the emeralds were secure. But he opened it only briefly, barely glanced inside, then locked it again quickly. Ah. Poirot's eyes glittered with interest. A man who examines his treasures with such haste either knows them to be safe or knows them to be gone. Miss Ashford, you mentioned seeing the collection last spring. Were all the pieces examined thoroughly? Victoria Ashford hesitated, her composure showing hairline cracks. Uncle Edward seemed particularly protective of the heart of Ceylon. The dealer, Mr. Godfrey, requested to examine it closely, but Uncle refused, said the mounting was too delicate to risk handling. Convenient, Dr. Pemberton murmured, then flushed as all eyes turned to him. Forgive me, but as a medical man, I recognize the behavior of someone concealing an uncomfortable truth. Poirot nodded approvingly. The doctor speaks wisely. Now, let us consider the poison itself. Dr. Pemberton, you mentioned chloral hydrate in the whiskey. This is different from the veronal found by the bedside, non? Chloral hydrate acts more quickly, Pemberton explained, his professional instincts overriding his nervousness. Mixed with alcohol, it would render someone unconscious within minutes. The veronal tablets were clearly placed as misdirection. And who in this household would have access to chloral hydrate? The silence stretched taut. Finally, Dr. Pemberton cleared his throat. I keep it in my medical bag for treating severe insomnia. Lady Whitmore has used it occasionally, and I provided some to Julian last week for examination anxiety. Julian Vane, who had been silent throughout, suddenly spoke. Uncle Edward asked me about it specifically. Wanted to know how it worked, whether it had a taste. I thought he was concerned about Lady Whitmore's dependency on sleeping draughts. When was this conversation? Poirot asked sharply. 3 days ago, the same day you received that first telegram, I believe. The pieces began forming a pattern in Poirot's mind. So Lord Whitmore was investigating the properties of chloral hydrate before summoning me. This suggests he suspected someone in his household of planning to use it against him. Captain James laughed harshly. Edward was always suspicious, saw conspiracies everywhere, especially after the debts mounted. Ah, but Captain, what if his suspicions were justified? Poirot moved to the empty safe, examining it with his magnifying glass. Consider this. Lord Whitmore discovers his emeralds have been replaced with paste copies. He cannot accuse openly without proof, so he summons me secretly. But someone learns of this plan and sends a second telegram to discourage my involvement. When that fails, they resort to murder. Lady Whitmore rose unsteadily. You're suggesting someone in this house has been systematically robbing us. I suggest that someone discovered Lord Whitmore's investigation and realized their deception was about to be exposed. The timing of everything, the telegram, the house party, the murder, speaks of desperate improvisation. Henley entered at that moment, his usual composure shattered. Forgive the interruption, but the gardener has made a discovery by the ornamental pond. We followed him outside, where Constable Williams stood holding a dripping velvet bag. Inspector Miller opened it carefully, revealing the Whitmore emeralds in all their legendary brilliance. But something was wrong with the tableau. The stones seemed too perfect, too conveniently discovered. Thrown away like rubbish, Miller observed. Our thief must have panicked. Or, Poirot said quietly, examining the largest stone, placed where they would be found at precisely the right moment. He looked up at Miss Ashford. Mademoiselle, you mentioned paste copies. Can you identify them among these? Victoria studied the heart of Ceylon carefully, her face growing pale. This isn't the copy, she whispered. This is the original. I know the flaw in the setting, a tiny chip Uncle Edward showed me years ago. The implications hit everyone simultaneously. If these were the real emeralds, then the theft was a fabrication. But if there were no paste copies, then Miss Ashford's earlier revelation was a lie. And if she had lied about that, what else might she be concealing? Poirot's smile was thin and dangerous. The little grey cells, they begin to see the pattern. Someone has been very clever, very methodical, but they have made one crucial error. They have underestimated the psychology of their victim. Lord Whitmore was not a man to be deceived easily, and his final actions tell us more about his killer than any physical evidence could. The net was closing, and everyone present knew it. The question was no longer whether there would be an arrest, but when and whom. The atmosphere within Whitmore Abbey had crystallized into something altogether more sinister, following the emerald discovery. The drawing room, with its pale walnut paneling and cheerful fire, seemed to mock the gravity of the situation. Poirot requested that everyone assemble there, his manner suggesting that the time for polite evasions had passed entirely. We shall approach this methodically, he announced, settling beside the fireplace with that peculiar composure that marked his most serious investigations. Each of you will recount your movements after dinner last evening. Not merely where you were, but what you observed, what you heard, what troubled your thoughts. In such details, the truth reveals itself. Lady Whitmore spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. I retired early with one of my headaches. Edward seemed different at dinner. Distracted, yet oddly resigned. He kissed my hand in the corridor and said that by morning many things would be set right. I assumed he meant Julian's future, or perhaps James's debts. Ah, Poirot murmured. A man who speaks of setting things right by morning does not contemplate ending his life. He speaks of resolution, not destruction. Continue, if you please. Captain James confessed to drinking heavily in the billiard room with Julian, then wandering the grounds in what he termed a futile attempt at clear thinking. His defiance cracked as he continued. Edward had told me about the new will. I was to inherit almost nothing. The estate, the title, the emeralds, all would pass to Julian, assuming he proved himself worthy. I was bitter, yes, but I swear I wished him no harm. When Victoria Ashford's turn came, her composure showed the first hairline fractures. I played piano until nearly 11, then retired to write letters. It was then I heard voices in the corridor. Uncle Edward speaking with Dr. Pemberton. The conversation seemed urgent, almost desperate. All eyes turned to the physician, whose face had assumed an unhealthy pallor. His lordship summoned me to his room, Pemberton admitted reluctantly. He questioned me extensively about drug dosages, veronal, chloral hydrate, even digitalis. He pressed me particularly about how long a man might survive after ingesting lethal quantities. I was deeply concerned he contemplated self-harm. "And yet," Poirot observed, "you did not alert Lady Whitmore or attempt to prevent this supposed suicide." He dismissed me curtly, saying that by morning all would be irreversibly clear. I hoped he would reconsider. Julian Vane's account came in halting phrases, his usual confidence completely eroded. He admitted to quarreling with Lord Whitmore earlier about money and career prospects. He called me ungrateful, irresponsible, said he had proof that someone close to him had betrayed his trust fundamentally. I assumed he meant me, but now you wonder if his suspicions lay elsewhere, Poirot finished. "Tell me, Monsieur Vane, did you attempt to overhear his later conversations?" Julian flushed crimson. "I passed his corridor after midnight. I heard voices but could not distinguish words. I went on to my room, I swear it." The silence stretched taut as Poirot absorbed these revelations. Then Lady Whitmore spoke again, her voice breaking. "There's something else." Edward had been receiving letters, anonymous letters threatening to expose certain indiscretions from his military service unless he paid a substantial sum. He was terrified of scandal, said it would destroy everything our family had built. "Blackmail," Inspector Miller breathed. "That explains the secrecy, the desperation." "Indeed," Poirot agreed. "But it raises a crucial question. Who among you knew of these letters?" The uncomfortable shifting of glances provided its own answer. Dr. Pemberton cleared his throat. "There is one more thing you should know. Lord Whitmore was dying. Cancer of the liver, perhaps 6 months remaining. He insisted on absolute secrecy, said he would not have his final months poisoned by pity or false kindness." The revelation hit the assembled company like a physical blow. Everything suddenly took on different dimensions. The urgency, the desperation, the need to resolve matters quickly. Poirot moved to the fireplace, stirring the dying embers with a poker. "So we have a dying man, blackmailed and desperate, who discovers that someone he trusts implicitly has betrayed him. He summons me in hopes of exposing the truth before death makes investigation impossible." He extracted a charred fragment of paper from the grate, holding it up to the light. In block capitals, 3 words remained legible: "Know the truth." "Someone attempted to destroy evidence last night," he observed quietly. "But fire, like murder, leaves traces for those who know how to read them. The blackmail letters, and their author, are the key to everything." The atmosphere in the room had shifted palpably. Fear, cold and immediate, settled over the guests like a shroud. The murderer sat among them, watching, calculating, perhaps planning their next desperate move. And Hercule Poirot, armed with fragments of burnt paper and the accumulated weight of human psychology, was methodically tightening the net around them. The afternoon light filtering through Lord Whitmore's study windows cast everything in shades of amber and shadow, lending an almost sepulchral quality to the room where the master of Whitmore Abbey had spent his final hours. Poirot had deliberately chosen this setting for his individual interviews, understanding that the proximity to death often loosened tongues that might otherwise remain guarded. The systematic interrogation. Victoria Ashford entered first, her usual composure showing hairline cracks under the weight of accumulated secrets. She settled into the leather chair opposite the massive desk, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles showed white against her dark gloves. "Mademoiselle," Poirot began with deceptive gentleness, "you have been less than truthful about several matters. The emeralds, for instance. You spoke of paste copies with such certainty, yet you also immediately recognized the genuine stones when they appeared. This suggests intimate knowledge of both authentic and false pieces." Victoria's facade crumbled like a dam giving way to floodwaters. "Uncle Edward confided in me 3 weeks ago. He had discovered that several pieces in the collection had been systematically replaced with paste copies over the past year. Someone with intimate access had been conducting a careful substitution, someone who understood both the stone's value and the family's habits. And the new will, mademoiselle. Dr. Pemberton has mentioned witnessing such a document." The question struck like lightning. Victoria's face went ashen, and for a moment she seemed unable to speak. He left almost everything to me," she whispered finally. "Not to Julian, as everyone assumed. The emeralds, the estate income, even this house, all were to come to me. He said Julian had proven himself unworthy through some recent actions. This revelation transformed every assumption about motive and opportunity. Julian had lied about his expectations, while Victoria had concealed her position as the primary beneficiary, a secret worth killing for. The doctor's dilemma. Dr. Pemberton entered with the bearing of a man approaching his own execution. His medical composure had entirely deserted him, replaced by the haunted expression of someone carrying unbearable knowledge. "Doctor," Poirot said without preamble, "you prescribed medications to Lord Whitmore, yet you also possessed substances that could kill him. The chloral hydrate in your medical bag. When did you last account for its contents?" Pemberton's face drained of all color. "A vial went missing 2 days ago. I assumed I had misplaced it during my rounds, but now—" He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing convulsively. "Monsieur Poirot, I swear upon my professional oath that I had nothing to do with Edward's death, but I must confess something that has tormented my conscience." He produced the folded will from his jacket with trembling fingers. "Lord Whitmore asked me to witness this document last week. I could not help but see its contents, the complete reversal of his previous intentions, leaving Victoria as primary heir, while reducing Julian to a modest annuity. The reason given was demonstrated moral unworthiness and betrayal of family trust." The captain's desperation. Captain James entered with the aggressive posture of a man determined to brazen out his difficulties. His military bearing could not disguise the telltale signs of a heavy drinker under extreme stress. The slight tremor in his hands, the 2 bright eyes, the careful precision of movement that spoke of constant vigilance against betraying weakness. "I suppose Victoria told you about my debts," he said without waiting for questions. "Yes, I owed substantial sums to people who don't accept excuses or delays. Edward refused to help, said I had already squandered enough family resources, but I didn't kill him for his money. Yet with your brother dead and Julian disgraced, you might have hoped to inherit despite the new will," Poirot observed mildly. James' laugh was harsh and entirely without humor. "I didn't even know about the bloody will until this morning. Besides, Edward was my brother. Whatever our differences, I would never have harmed him." "But you were unaware of his terminal illness." The captain's silence provided its own answer. He had not known his brother was dying, which meant his financial desperation remained a viable motive for murder. The young man's confession. Julian Vane arrived last, his youthful confidence completely shattered. He looked as though he had aged a decade overnight, his face gaunt with sleepless anxiety and guilt. "I know what you must think," he began, before Poirot could speak, "that I killed Uncle Edward to secure my inheritance. But I swear I didn't know he had changed the will. I believed I still stood to inherit everything. Yet you quarreled with him about money." Poirot pressed gently. "He called you ungrateful, irresponsible. What prompted such harsh words from a man who had shown you paternal affection? Julian's composure shattered completely. He discovered I had been forging his signature on bank drafts. Small amounts at first, then larger sums as my debts mounted. I was desperate. Creditors were threatening exposure, ruin. He said he would disinherit me completely unless I confessed everything to the family and made full restitution. The confession hung in the air like incense, heavy with implications. Here was demonstrated dishonesty, desperate need, and access to Lord Whitmore's financial instruments. The hidden evidence. After the interviews concluded, Poirot turned his attention to Lord Whitmore's desk with renewed purpose. Using his magnifying glass, he examined the blotting pad with the care of an archaeologist studying ancient tablets. "Observe, Hastings," he said, holding the pad up to the mirror above the mantelpiece. "The ghostly imprints tell their own story. Here, expecting final payment Friday. Silence guaranteed." The blackmailer grew impatient. "And here, in Lord Whitmore's own hand. Trap is set. P arrives Saturday." "A trap?" Inspector Miller echoed, bewildered. "Precisely. Lord Whitmore knew the identity of his tormentor. He summoned me not merely to investigate, but to witness the unmasking. But observe this additional notation, a list of symptoms: nausea, weakness, irregular heartbeat. He was documenting his own gradual poisoning." Poirot moved to the bookshelf, extracting a volume on medicinal plants. It fell open to a page describing digitalis purpurea, foxglove, with pencil notations in the margins detailing dosages and symptoms. He suspected someone was attempting to poison him slowly with digitalis, disguising the symptoms as natural decline from his illness. But when the killer learned of my impending arrival, they abandoned the slow method for the immediate solution of chloral hydrate. The garden's secret. Our investigation led us to the ornamental pond where the emeralds had been discovered. Poirot examined the nearby flower beds with intense concentration, particularly the foxgloves that grew in wild profusion near the water's edge. The gardener, old Thomas, confirmed our suspicions with rustic directness. "Aye, someone's been at the foxgloves proper clumsy-like, leaves stripped off near the water's edge. Thought it was rabbits at first, but rabbits don't use knives. Same day his lordship came down asking which plants was poisonous." The final synthesis. As evening shadows lengthened across the estate, Poirot assembled the evidence with his characteristic precision. Lord Whitmore discovered he was being slowly poisoned with digitalis. He began his own investigation, documenting symptoms and researching the poison. When he identified his would-be killer, he set a trap, summoning me as witness while pretending vulnerability about the emeralds. He paused, his green eyes reflecting the dying light. But the killer learned of this plan and was forced to abandon the subtle approach for crude immediacy. The chloral hydrate in the whiskey, the staged suicide, the theatrical theft, all desperate improvisations by someone who believed they could outwit both the living and the dead. The trap, he concluded with quiet satisfaction, was never truly about the emeralds. It was about forcing a careful killer into reckless action. And tomorrow, in the library, we shall spring Lord Whitmore's final snare and reveal the name of the person who feared Hercule Poirot's arrival enough to commit murder. The house seemed to hold its breath as darkness fell, its windows glowing like watchful eyes. Inside, a killer waited, believing themselves safe behind walls of deception, but they had underestimated both a dying man's determination and a Belgian detective's relentless pursuit of truth. The morning light streamed through the tall windows of Whitmore Abbey's library, casting long shadows across the assembled company. The room held the hushed expectancy of a courtroom awaiting verdict, with every member of the household present in their appointed places. Lady Whitmore sat pale and rigid, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles showed white. Captain James maintained his military bearing despite the obvious strain, while Victoria Ashford positioned herself near the bookshelves with studied composure. Julian Vane gripped the back of a leather chair, his youthful face drawn with anxiety, and Dr. Pemberton stood by the window, his professional demeanor finally cracking under the weight of accumulated tension. Inspector Miller occupied his position by the door, notebook ready, while Henley maintained his butler's discretion in the corner. Poirot took his place before the fireplace, his small figure somehow dominating the vast room through sheer intellectual presence. The systematic revelation. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began, his voice carrying perfect clarity to every corner of the room. "We gather this morning to conclude the business for which Lord Whitmore summoned me, though not, alas, in the manner he intended. He wished me to witness the exposure of a thief and blackmailer. Instead, I must reveal a murderer who believed themselves clever enough to outwit both the living and the dead." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the assembly like a shroud. "This case has been a masterpiece of misdirection, constructed by someone who understood that the best place to hide a lie is between two truths. We were presented with a suicide that was murder, a theft that was theater, and a victim who was, in his final days, a detective pursuing his own case with remarkable tenacity." Moving to the mantelpiece, Poirot retrieved the charred fragment of paper he had discovered in the fireplace. Lord Whitmore knew he was dying. The cancer would claim him within months, yet someone in this house could not wait for nature to take its course. Someone began poisoning him with digitalis, disguising the symptoms as natural progression of his illness. But Lord Whitmore was no fool. He recognized that his decline did not match his doctor's prognosis, and he began documenting the discrepancies. Dr. Pemberton shifted uncomfortably. The symptoms were consistent with his condition. Were they, doctor? Or were they consistent with digitalis poisoning administered by someone with medical knowledge? Poirot's green eyes fixed on the physician. Someone who knew exactly how to mask murder as natural death. "The emerald deception, but let us speak of the emeralds," Poirot continued, his voice taking on a note of admiration. "Here we encounter Lord Whitmore's masterstroke, a trap so elegant that even I initially failed to appreciate its brilliance. You see, the Whitmore emeralds were never stolen. They were never even at risk." He produced a small velvet pouch from his pocket, opening it to reveal the magnificent Heart of Ceylon. "Months ago, Lord Whitmore commissioned perfect paste copies of his entire collection, not because he feared theft, but because he wished to test the honesty of those closest to him. He replaced the genuine stones with these copies and waited to see who would attempt to steal them." The revelation struck the room like lightning. Victoria gasped audibly, while Julian's face cycled from pale to flushed and back again. Someone did indeed steal what they believed were priceless emeralds, Poirot continued relentlessly, only to discover, through expert examination, that they had risked everything for worthless paste. The genuine collection remained safely hidden in Lord Whitmore's private vault, a second safe whose existence was known only to himself and his solicitor. He let this revelation settle before continuing. The theft of the paste copies created panic. The thief realized they had been deceived, but worse. They understood that Lord Whitmore knew of their dishonesty. Hence the desperate return of the stolen gems to the ornamental pond, hoping to convince investigators that a genuine theft had occurred and been abandoned. The elimination of suspects. Poirot began to pace, his measured steps marking time like a metronome of justice. "Let us consider each of you in turn. Julian, you admitted to forging your uncle's signature on bank drafts, a serious crime, but one that Lord Whitmore was prepared to forgive if you made full restitution. Your inheritance was threatened, yes, but not eliminated entirely." Julian nodded miserably. "He said I could redeem myself through honest work." "Captain Whitmore," Poirot continued, turning to James, "your debts are substantial, your creditors pressing. But you did not know of your brother's terminal illness, which means you had no reason to believe inheritance was imminent. Moreover, the new will would have left you with nothing, hardly a motive for murder when patience might have served better." James's military composure held, but his eyes betrayed relief at being eliminated from suspicion. "Dr. Pemberton?" Poirot said softly. "You had access to poisons, knowledge of their effects, and opportunity to administer them, but you also had professional ethics and genuine affection for your patient. More significantly, you would gain nothing from his death. Indeed, you would lose a valuable client and friend." The doctor's shoulders sagged with relief, though his face remained troubled. "The true motive revealed. Which brings us to you, Mademoiselle Ashford," Poirot said, his voice taking on a dangerous quietness. "The primary beneficiary of the new will, inheriting not only the emeralds but the estate income and this very house. A fortune worth killing for, one might think." Victoria lifted her chin defiantly. "I loved my uncle. I would never harm him for money." "Ah, but it was not for money that you killed him," Poirot replied with devastating gentleness. "It was for fear that he would discover a secret that would cost you everything you hoped to inherit." He moved to the bookshelf and extracted a slim volume of Keats's poetry, its leather binding worn smooth by handling. "Lord Whitmore found this in your room 3 days before his death, mademoiselle. Hidden within its pages was a draft of one of the blackmail letters, not received through the post, but written in your own hand." The silence was absolute, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock and Lady Whitmore's sharp intake of breath. "You see," Poirot continued, opening the book to reveal a folded paper, "Lord Whitmore's military service included certain irregularities in the handling of regimental funds. Nothing criminal, but embarrassing enough to damage his reputation if revealed. You discovered these details among his private papers and saw an opportunity to extract money before your inheritance came through." Victoria's composure finally cracked. "You don't understand. I needed the money desperately. I had debts, obligations." "You had a husband," Poirot interrupted quietly. "A secret marriage to a man of questionable reputation, a union that would have meant immediate disinheritance if discovered. The blackmail was meant to provide funds to support this clandestine relationship until you could safely reveal it after inheriting the estate." The final accusation. "But Lord Whitmore discovered your deception," Poirot continued, his voice growing stronger. "He confronted you about the blackmail letters, threatened to expose your marriage and disinherit you completely. Faced with losing everything, you decided that your uncle must die before he could change his will again." He held up the burnt paper fragment. "You sent the second telegram using his personal stationery, hoping to prevent my arrival. When that failed, you abandoned the slow poisoning with digitalis, too risky with a detective coming, and used chloral hydrate stolen from Dr. Pemberton's medical bag. You dissolved it in your uncle's evening whiskey during your customary good-night visit, then arranged the theatrical suicide scene with the veronal tablets." Victoria stood frozen, her face a mask of terrified realization. I never meant he was dying anyway. I just needed a little more time." "Time that you purchased with murder," Poirot said gravely. "You killed a man who had shown you nothing but kindness, who had planned to make you his heir, who would have forgiven even your deception if you had approached him honestly." Inspector Miller stepped forward, his handcuffs ready. "Miss Victoria Ashford, I arrest you for the murder of Lord Whitmore." As the killer was led away, her composure finally shattered completely. Poirot stood by the fireplace, his expression grave. The trap that Lord Whitmore had set with such careful precision had finally sprung, revealing not just a thief of emeralds, but a thief of life itself, a betrayal that struck at the very heart of family trust and human decency. The case was closed, but the echoes of its tragedy would linger long in the halls of Whitmore Abbey. The silence that followed Victoria Ashford's arrest was profound, settling over the library like dust after a violent storm. Lady Whitmore sat motionless in her chair, her face a study in incomprehension and grief, while the remaining members of the household struggled to absorb the devastating revelation that the murderer had worn the mask of a devoted niece. Captain James collapsed into a leather armchair, his military bearing finally abandoning him completely. "I never suspected," he muttered, his voice hollow with shock. "Victoria always seemed so devoted to Edward. How could she have deceived us all so thoroughly?" "Because, Captain," Poirot replied gently, moving to the window where afternoon shadows stretched across the grounds. "She understood that the most effective disguise is sincerity. Mademoiselle Ashford genuinely loved her uncle. That emotion was never feigned. But love, alas, is not always stronger than fear or greed." Dr. Pemberton had retrieved his medical bag and was attending to Lady Whitmore with professional efficiency, though his hands still trembled slightly. The digitalis poisoning. How long had she been administering it? "Perhaps 3 months, Poirot replied, consulting his notes with characteristic precision. "She began shortly after Lord Whitmore announced his intention to revise his will in her favor. The poison was administered in his nightly chamomile tea, their special ritual, as Lady Whitmore called it. The bitter taste was masked by honey and herbs, while the symptoms were attributed to his cancer's natural progression." Julian Vane stood by the desk, his youthful face showing a mixture of relief and lingering shame. "What happens now, with the will and everything else?" "Your uncle's final will remains valid, Monsieur Vane," Poirot assured him. "Despite your transgressions, he never truly lost faith in your potential for redemption. The estate passes to you, with provisions for Lady Whitmore's comfort and a modest allowance for Captain James." He paused, allowing the weight of responsibility to settle on the young man's shoulders. "But remember, Lord Whitmore forgave your financial dishonesty because he believed you capable of better things. Do not disappoint his memory a second time." Lady Whitmore's voice emerged as a broken whisper. "The emeralds, the real ones?" "Safe in Lord Whitmore's private vault in London," Poirot confirmed. "He removed them months ago when his suspicions first arose. The stones found in the pond were the paste copies he commissioned, worthless as gems, but priceless as evidence of guilt." As preparations for departure began, I found myself walking with Poirot through the corridors that had witnessed such tragedy. The house seemed to exhale centuries of accumulated secrets, its very stones bearing witness to the eternal drama of human frailty. "It is a ghastly business, Poirot," I remarked as we collected our belongings. "To tear apart a family, to leave them with such knowledge. Do you never feel that justice comes at too great a cost?" Poirot adjusted his hat with meticulous care, his green eyes reflecting the dying light. "You speak of justice as though it were a luxury, mon ami, an ornament to be worn when convenient. But justice is not a jewel one displays. It is a foundation stone. Remove it, and all the fine things built above will collapse." "Still," I persisted, "Victoria was not a monster. Desperate, yes, misguided, but there was love there, surely." He sighed, his gaze taking in the portraits of long-dead Whitmores that lined the walls. "You confuse motive with justification, Hastings. Most killers love someone or something. Victoria loved her independence, her secret life, her future as she imagined it. But love that demands a life in payment is not love. It is hunger wearing a mask." As our taxi wound down the drive, leaving the imposing stone facade behind us, Lady Whitmore had insisted on bidding us farewell personally. Despite her grief, she maintained the dignity that centuries of breeding had instilled. "Thank you, Monsieur Poirot," she had said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "Edward trusted you to find the truth, and you have honored that trust." Now, watching Whitmore Abbey recede into the gathering dusk, Poirot leaned back against the seat with characteristic precision. "Do you recall, Hastings, what Lord Whitmore said on that final evening, that by morning many things would be set right? He believed he would live to see the resolution of his own mystery. Instead, he bought the truth with his life. You think he knew he might be killed? I think he suspected the possibility. Yet he summoned me nonetheless. There is a particular courage in that decision, a willingness to face the truth, whatever its cost. The countryside rolled past in shades of amber and grey, autumn's melancholy beauty providing a fitting backdrop to our thoughts. It is curious, I observed, how it all began with emeralds, stones dug from the earth, and ended with the revelation of something far more precious, the truth. Poirot's smile was thin and infinitely sad. Ah, but there you touch upon the heart of it, mon ami. It was never about the emeralds themselves, but what people believed about them. Inheritance, security, status. Value exists in the mind, and it was these imagined meanings that became deadly. As our train appeared through the evening mist, he rose with his usual fastidiousness. Come, Hastings. The world continues to turn, even after murder. There will be other puzzles, other mysteries where the little grey cells must restore order from chaos. It is a small service, perhaps, but it is the one for which I am best suited. The case of the Whitmore emeralds was closed, leaving only the quiet satisfaction of justice served and the lingering melancholy that always follows the unmasking of a killer who wore the face of a friend. The return journey to London unfolded with the measured rhythm of wheels against rails, each mile carrying us further from the Gothic tragedy of Whitmore Abbey toward the familiar rationality of the metropolis. Poirot sat opposite me in our first-class compartment, his green eyes reflecting the dying light of the Gloucestershire countryside as it dissolved into evening shadows. His characteristic precision remained intact, every crease of his clothing perfect, his moustaches immaculate, yet something in his demeanor suggested the weight of recent revelations. "You are contemplating the human cost, mon ami," he observed, without turning from the window. "It is written in your silence." "Victoria seemed so devoted to her uncle," I said quietly. "How does someone capable of such affection become capable of murder?" Poirot's fingers drummed a silent pattern against the window frame. "Ah, but that is precisely the point, Hastings. She did not cease to love Lord Whitmore. She loved him even as she poisoned his whiskey. This is what makes her crime so particularly tragic. She murdered not from hatred, but from desperation born of deception." He turned to face me fully, his expression grave. "Consider the progression, if you please. First, the secret marriage to a man her family would never accept, a choice born of romantic rebellion. Then the blackmail to fund this clandestine life when her allowance proved insufficient. Each step seemed logical, even necessary, yet each step led inevitably to the next. Murder was not her goal. It was simply the final move in a game she had been playing since her wedding day. The train passed through a small station, its platform lights flickering like candles in the gathering dusk. "The emeralds," I said. "They were never really the point, were they?" "No, they were symbols, representations of value, inheritance, position. Lord Whitmore understood this when he commissioned the paste copies. He created a test, you see, knowing that someone close to him harbored dishonest intentions. When Victoria stole what she believed were priceless stones, only to discover their worthlessness, she realized her uncle knew of her treachery. Poirot extracted a small object from his waistcoat pocket, a single, flawless paste emerald. I retrieved this from the library floor, where it had fallen during our investigation, worthless as a gem, yet priceless as evidence. It represents everything about this case, the confusion between appearance and reality, the tragedy of misplaced values. And Lord Whitmore's final gambit? Magnificent in its simplicity. He summoned me not merely to solve a crime, but to witness the unmasking of someone he still hoped might prove innocent. Even dying, even betrayed, he gave Victoria every opportunity to confess, to throw herself upon his mercy. Instead, she chose murder, believing she could outwit both the living and the dead. The lights of London began to appear on the horizon, scattered points of civilization emerging from the darkness. The contrast with the isolated tragedy we had left behind seemed particularly stark. "Will you attend the trial?" I asked. Poirot shook his head decisively. My role is concluded, Hastings. I have served Lord Whitmore's final wish by exposing the truth. The machinery of justice must now proceed without further assistance from Hercule Poirot. As our train pulled into Paddington Station, the familiar cacophony of London life engulfed us. Porters shouting, steam hissing, the general bustle of a great city that never truly sleeps. It was a world away from the hushed corridors and deadly secrets of Whitmore Abbey. Home, Poirot announced with satisfaction, signaling for a porter. There will be correspondence to answer, accounts to settle, and perhaps a tisane to soothe the mind. The little grey cells have earned their rest. Until the next case, I observed, smiling despite the melancholy that still clung to our recent experiences. Ah, the next case, he murmured, his eyes twinkling with renewed interest. Let us hope it involves something simple, a missing lapdog, perhaps, or a dispute over a bridge score. I've had quite enough of family secrets and precious stones for 1 week. But as our taxi merged into the stream of London traffic, I knew that whatever puzzle next presented itself, Hercule Poirot would meet it with the same meticulous brilliance that had unraveled the mystery at Whitmore Abbey. The game, as they say, would always be afoot, and so concluded the affair of the Whitmore emeralds, a case that began with a contradiction in telegrams and ended with a confession, wrung from a killer who believed herself too clever for detection. Lord Whitmore had indeed met the detective he was not supposed to encounter, and in that meeting, justice had finally been served, cold and precise as the stones themselves. The truth had emerged from shadows and deception, leaving behind a silence that was, at last, honest. The geometric precision of Whitehaven mansions welcomed us like a sanctuary after the Gothic chaos of Whitmore Abbey. Where the countryside estate had been all shadows and secrets, drafts and deception, Poirot's London flat represented order restored, every surface gleaming, every ornament aligned with mathematical exactitude, every comfort precisely calibrated to soothe the rational mind. Georges materialized with his customary silent efficiency, relieving us of our coats and producing steaming tisane as though our return had been choreographed rather than merely anticipated. Poirot moved immediately to his mirror, attending to moustaches that had suffered from the damp Gloucestershire air, his ritual of self-restoration as methodical as everything else in his ordered existence. "It is curious, Hastings," he observed, settling into his favorite armchair with evident satisfaction, "how quickly one appreciates civilization after witnessing its absence. At Whitmore Abbey, we saw the consequences of a household where appearances mattered more than substance, where paste was valued as highly as genuine stones." I settled opposite him, feeling the accumulated tension of recent days beginning to dissipate. Victoria seemed so genuine in her affection for Lord Whitmore. How does someone capable of such devotion become capable of murder? Poirot's green eyes grew distant, as though seeing again the library where truth had finally emerged from its elaborate disguise. "Ah, but that is precisely the tragedy, mon ami. She did not cease to love her uncle. She loved him even as she dissolved poison in his whiskey. This makes her crime infinitely more heartbreaking than simple hatred ever could." He rose and moved to his desk, extracting from a drawer the correspondence that had begun our involvement in the affair. Lord Whitmore's desperate summons, followed by the false dismissal. Consider the progression of her deception. First, the secret marriage to a man her family would never accept. Then the blackmail to fund this clandestine life when her allowance proved insufficient. Each step seemed logical, even necessary, yet each led inevitably to the next. Murder was not her goal. It was simply the final move in a game she had been playing since her wedding day. A knock interrupted our reflections. Georges entered bearing a small package wrapped in brown paper, its weight suggesting something precious within. The accompanying note bore Julian Vane's careful script. "Monsieur Poirot, Uncle Edward would have wished you to have this. not as payment for your services transcend monetary value, but as remembrance. You honored his final request and proved that truth endures beyond death. The emerald represents what he valued most, not wealth, but integrity. With profound gratitude, Julian Vane. Inside lay the heart of Ceylon, its deep green depths seeming to hold centuries of accumulated secrets. Poirot held it to the window, where afternoon sunlight revealed the stone's perfect clarity. No bubbles, no inconsistencies, no flaws that would betray artificial origin. Magnificent, he murmured, yet ultimately just compressed carbon arranged by geological accident into pleasing patterns. Lord Whitmore understood this. He knew the emerald's true value lay not in their beauty, but in what they revealed about human nature. Will you keep it? I shall return it to young Vane with instructions to place it in a museum, Poirot replied decisively. Let it be appreciated by all, rather than hoarded by one. Besides, the letter tells me everything I need to know about the case's ultimate resolution. He showed me additional pages that had accompanied the emerald, updates on the aftermath we had left behind. Victoria had been tried, convicted, and sentenced to life imprisonment, a mercy granted due to her youth and the mitigating circumstances of desperation. But more significantly, Julian had undergone a remarkable transformation, settling all his debts, assuming his responsibilities with unexpected maturity, and establishing a scholarship in Lord Whitmore's name for young men of talent but limited means. Tragedy, Poirot observed, has accomplished what prosperity never could. It has made him worthy of his inheritance. Captain James, too, has found redemption in responsibility, managing the estate farms with dedication and maintaining sobriety for the first time in years. As evening shadows lengthened across London, Poirot carefully returned the emerald to its velvet case. Lord Whitmore died knowing the truth would emerge. That knowledge, I think, brought him peace in his final moments. He had set his trap with such precision that even death could not prevent its springing. So you believe the outcome justifies the cost? I believe, he said softly, that truth is not a luxury to be weighed against convenience. It is the foundation upon which all else must rest. Remove it, and even the finest emeralds become mere stones, beautiful perhaps, but ultimately meaningless. The case was truly concluded now, filed away with the same precision that governed every aspect of Poirot's existence. Justice had been served, order restored, and the living had learned to honor the dead through their own transformation. In the end, Lord Whitmore had indeed met the detective he was not supposed to encounter, and in that meeting, truth had triumphed over deception as surely as genuine stones reveal paste copies under proper examination. The little gray cells rested, satisfied with their work, awaiting the next puzzle that would require their unique services.